Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 2021 Digital Isle of Wight Literary Festival. Before we go any further, can I ask all those of you in the room please to turn off your mobile phones so you are not embarrassed later on and we don't have to point at you. We're delighted to be back in the ballroom of Northwood House with an invited audience, socially distanced, of benefactors, sponsors, friends and volunteers. It's wonderful to see you all and wonderful to get this glorious festival underway. This year, we're delighted that our loyal sponsors have continued to support us. Our thanks to Red Funnel, Northwood House and Rouse Limited, who have enabled us by their generosity to stream this digital festival free of charge. Will you give them a round of applause? We're very grateful for that. I can't think of a better way of starting this festival than with an author whose books are not only well-researched biographies, but also incredibly readable. As a devourer of biographies, and if you're the same, you'll know that is not always the case. But having read Andrew Lownie's book about the Mountbattens, I can attest that they are extraordinarily readable. Oh, look, somebody's phone already. Isn't it nice it went off now rather than in the middle? The fairies come. This is Andrew's latest, Traitor King, the Scandalous Exile of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. That's whetted your appetite. I shall say no more except to thank Andrew enormously for coming along and welcoming Andrew Lownie.
Well, ladies, gentlemen, and those transitioning, thank you very much, Alan, for that kind introduction. I had one the other day and they said, do you want to speak now or shall we let them enjoy themselves a bit longer? I feel a bit with the sponsors. I always remember, I love coming here. I'm so grateful you've asked me to come back. I always remember the difference you pay to your sponsors before each talk and clearly how valuable they are to you. And I'm thinking of some of the wonderful sort of productions one could put on with the appropriate sponsor. So, for example, Macbeth with Scottish Widows, The Flying Dutchman sponsored by KLM. Anyway, we're here to talk about The Traitor King. And this is a slightly unusual take on the Duke of Windsor. There have been scores of books on the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, but they all focus on the abdication. And in my view, the abdication can't really be understood unless you understand his character and what actually happened afterwards. He actually lived for 36 years after 1936, and Wallis for another 50 years. And I always felt, reading these books, that they talked about some of the things that he did after 1936, the way that he was perhaps involved with the Nazis, and they always passed it off as he was an innocent dupe, he was naive, but nothing more. And it always seemed to me that there was more to it than that. And so I began to go into the archives. These archives have been there for a long time. No one's bothered even looking at them. I have to say, I didn't go looking at the archives in this country because they've all been weeded. But I went to Portugal and France and Spain, and my best source was the Bahamas, where there's actually a mirror set of the British files in the Bahamas, which have not been weeded. I mean, they have probably now, but not when I did my research. So I think by looking at the story from 1936 onwards, I think we get a completely different take on the abdication. Actually, why, I would argue, Baldwin and politicians maneuvered him into a position where he had to abdicate. Churchill famously said, "Our cock won't fight." And also, I think it explains the attitude of the royal family afterwards. It wasn't the bitterness of the abdication, it's actually down to the fact that he was the traitor king. It's a very emphatic title, there's no question mark there. When I started it, historians all said to me, good luck, this is the end of your career, before it's even started. And the very reassuring thing was to find that the first review we had in the TLS said that he's made his case, and other reviews have said the same. So what I would propose to do in the next 3.5 hours is just to go through a quick rundown of the story. The book actually begins in December 1936, but just a little bit of background. Here's this angelic-looking boy, born in 1894, the Duke the Prince of Wales. I think the other interesting thing you have to understand is really what a difficult and emotionally barren childhood both he and Wallis have. They were actually drawn together. All of George V's and Queen Mary's children were pretty damaged by their upbringing. George V was a tyrant. Queen Mary was just a completely cold woman. And Wallis also had the same experience. Her father died when she was very young. She was brought up in sort of genteel poverty by an uncle. Her mum ran a sort of boarding house. And she was always desperate after that for security and actually for some sort of luxurious lifestyle. Anyway, here they are as they grow up. That's him in his garter robes. And there she is, this is a young woman. And she really escapes her family by marrying this airman called Win Spencer, who turned out to be a complete bully and a drunk. And she ran away from him very quickly and went to China, where she learned all sorts of sexual techniques, I'm told. And he, meanwhile, was going around the empire also learning sexual techniques, ostensibly to thank the empire for their help during the war, also to help teach him kingship, but mainly to keep him away from all the married women in London that he was chasing. And this was one of them, Lady Frida Dudley Ward, married to a Liberal MP. He was always very keen on much older women, mother figures, married. And I thought it was quite revealing. This relationship went on for many years. He was almost like a father to her two daughters. In fact, he used to give them a pearl each year for their birthday to build a necklace. But as soon as he met Wallis in 1931, he never even did a Dear John letter to her. He literally, the first she discovered of it was when the palace switchboard wouldn't put through the calls to her. And the children suddenly were cut out and there were no more pearls. But it's very interesting, if you look at the correspondence, he writes in baby talk to her. He never actually grew up, both physically, because of some bumps he suffered as a child, and also emotionally. He actually didn't need to shave very often. And that's how he kept these very youthful looks. Wallis then married a man called Andrew Simpson, who's half American. He'd been at Harvard, he'd been in the Grenadier Guards, and ran a shipping company. And actually, one of the interesting things there is that she never really fell out of love with him. She enjoyed the status of being the Prince of Wales' mistress, but actually she liked the security of being married to Ernest, and she never wanted to marry the Prince of Wales. It was only because he threatened to kill himself that she was emotionally blackmailed into doing so. And that, again, gives us a fresh insight into the marriage, which was not the great love affair that everyone has written about. This is another person that she's supposed to have had a love affair with, Joachim Ribbentrop, the German ambassador in London. He was certainly a close friend of hers. Supposedly, he sent her 17 carnations every day to mark the number of times they'd made love. Since they didn't meet 17 times, I'm not quite sure what that meant. But he was a very important figure, and the Germans realized that Edward was very pro-German. He was 14th, 16th German. His mother was a German princess. He spoke fluent German. He felt he was German, and he liked getting dressed up in Austrian gear and eating schnitzel and stuff like that. As a result of that, he wanted, as king, to be much more involved politically than the constitutional monarch really should be. And this was raising warning signs amongst the politicians and the civil servants in the royal household. He was also incredibly indiscreet. And because he was so pro-German, particularly through his friendship with his cousins, people like Prince Philip of Hesse and the Duke of Saxe-Coburg, there were warning signals going up right through the 1930s. Wallis was also, because she was close to Ribbentrop, in fact, Ribbentrop had sent agents there was one called Stephanie von Hollenhau who actually went to the apartment beside her in Bryanston Court. So this is the setting for the abdication and indeed what happens later on. And this is the other interesting thing. We again think of them as extremely monogamous. But one of the extraordinary things is this is the only monarch in British history who was bugged by MI5. They actually, in 1935, went into Buckingham, into St. James's Park and basically tapped the telephone lines. And so the great thing, and biographers we love MI5 having taps and surveillance because we get all the detail of what happened. So the extraordinary thing is MI5 said this Wallis is rather suspicious, and then discovered that not only was Wallis having an affair with this car salesman called Guy Trundle, along with the Duke, but he was having an affair with some Austrian woman at the same time. So again, it's a slightly more complex and nuanced picture than perhaps the books, the Madonna version, shall we say. Anyway, the place he really loved going was this place called Fort Belvedere in Windsor Great Park. He used to entertain there. But again, there were great concerns. He would leave his red box open. There were Germans coming to stay. It was his bolt hole, but at the same time, it was a place of great insecurity. This is the funeral of his father, George V, in January 1936. His father had said that boy will ruin himself within a year. Well, it didn't take a year. 324 days is as long as he reigned. The abdication crisis, we all think of stretching out through 1936, but actually, no one really in this country knew about it until December, literally the week before he went. That's when the press started writing about it. So it was extraordinary, rapid, in a sense, fall from grace. This is him on the Nile cruise in October 1936, when he went around the Adriatic, taking various people. Diana Cooper was there, Dickie Mountbatten. And there was some coverage in the foreign press, and that's when people realized how intimate they were and how familiar they were with each other. But it's very interesting, if you read Lady Diana Cooper's diary from the Nile, which is Churchill College Archives, she writes about how Wallis comes up to her and says, "Look, don't leave me alone with the man. He's so boring. I really want nothing more to do with him." And this was in October 1936, before she married him. I mean, normally you get bored afterwards. And this is when the whole book begins. I begin on the night of the abdication. He goes down, he gives the abdication speech in Windsor Castle with Lord Reith beside him, and then he literally is driven to say goodbye to his family. They're all in tears. These events have rather overtaken them. Bertie is stammering and is almost completely neurotic. He never expected to become king. And Queen Mary, of course, is still very cold. And he then is driven with his private detective down to Portsmouth to catch a boat across to the continent. Originally, he was due to go on a boat called the HMS Enchantress, but that thought wasn't very appropriate. So they switched it to HMS Fury. Anyway, he goes across. He goes across to. She's in the south of France, waiting for her degree absolute to come through, and he goes to Austria to stay at the home of the Rothschild family, this place called Enzenfield. And he goes there waiting for the decree to come through. Now, he's an appalling house guest. He plays not only the accordion, but the bagpipes till 3 o'clock in the morning. The definition of a gentleman is someone who can play the bagpipes but doesn't. He keeps his ADC, Fruity Metcalf, up all night, and then poor Fruity has to work the next morning. He runs up huge telephone bills, which he expects Kitty to pay for. She puts on lavish Christmas parties for him, which he doesn't bother to attend. She gives him these wonderful presents, and he gives her a signed photo of himself. So it's not really a very happy moment. This is also the moment when he negotiates the financial settlement with his family. And the deal is that he'll get £25,000 a year, which is what the younger son of the king would have got. And he has to give up his life share in Balmoral and Sandringham. He plays hardball. He says, look, if I don't get more money, I'm going to lease it to a syndicate of American businessmen. But George VI discovers that actually he doesn't need any money. He saved so much money from the civil list over the last few years and the Duchy of Lancaster income that if he goes to Parliament and asks for money and they ask, what's the situation, they'll never get any money again. So the royal family actually pay him his 25 grand and hope he'll go away. But it's something of great. It's the beginning of the family feud. Anyway, he eventually gets married in June 1937 at this place called the Château de Candie in the Loire, and he's very sad to discover that his brothers and indeed Mountbatten, who he'd been best man for, aren't allowed to come to the wedding. He really has no family there, nor does she, apart from her Aunt Bessie. So we have here Herman Rogers to the right of Wallis, who in fact was a very close friend, and the man that actually she was always said that she was most deeply in love with. And then Fruity Metcalf, the man on the left. The book is filled with people called things like Fruity and Baba. I really recommend it. And then here, you may recognize Randolph Churchill on the far right, and the man with the big nose further down is the Reverend Robert Jardine, and he was a minister from Darlington who actually he felt that they should have a religious ceremony, and so he actually left the Church of England because they had banned anyone marrying him in a religious ceremony, and came out to marry him. He then lived off the proceeds the rest of his life touring America. And that's the Chateau de Candie, which you can go and visit to this day. So they get married there, and this is the first of his rather unfortunate friends. The man who lends him Chateau de Candie is called Charles Beddoe. He's Franco-American. He's actually a German agent. He's got huge companies. He's a time and motion study person, has huge companies in Germany, and is very close to the Nazi regime. And he basically, all these people are targeting the Duke. They know he's vulnerable. They know he's susceptible to their blandishments. And so the deal is that he'll have the use of the castle, but that the Duke and the Duchess will go and tour Germany in October 1937. And this becomes a bit of a propaganda coup for the Germans, but a bit of an embarrassment for the British government. And anyway, this is where they went and had their honeymoon, a very strange place because it was reputed that a woman had killed all 7 of her husbands on their honeymoon there. But anyway, they went to this place. It's just outside Vienna. And then this is Charles Beddoe, very fetching, with his wife Fern. And so this is where they plotted their tour of Germany in October 1937. And here we are. I don't know if he's just if he's giving the Nazi salute or he's just waving. But basically, he went and saw Hitler. He visited Goering. He went to visited SS troops. He saw a concentration camp. It was all done without telling anyone. So it was a bit of a blow when the British discovered what he was up to. And so that was, in a sense, I call this the scandalous exile of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. This is the first of the scandals. And of course, Bertie was trying to establish himself on the throne. He wasn't very confident. They knew that a lot of the Duke's supporters were Mosleyites. In fact, there had been huge demonstrations on the night of the 12th of December 36. They'd actually come down to Buckingham Palace, "We want our king." There had been huge rallies the next day. And there was a real concern with the Met that actually, unless he was sent out into exile, he could be a focal point for these Mosleyites. So he has to be kept in exile. And so he goes, and because he likes to live rather extravagantly, he takes the lease of this house, the Château de la Croix in Antibes. If I say it's now owned by Roman Abramovich, you'll get some idea of how luxurious it is. And he also takes the lease of this house in Paris. And actually what he wants to do is to set up almost an alternative court. He wants to give Wallis the lifestyle that in some ways he's had to abandon. And he does that partly because he's got lots of money and partly because he gets lots of other people to pay for it. So this is just to sort of give you an idea of what the place looks like. They were extraordinary, they lived an extraordinarily luxurious life. So, for example, they would entertain generally 24 for dinner. And one night, when they only had 6 to dinner, the butler said, "What's happened?" And she said, "Yes, but they are all kings." So that's the small dining room. Anyway, when war breaks out, Chamberlain sends a plane to pick them up, to bring them back. It's the 3rd of September. And the Duke and the Duchess refuse to get onto it. They say, "It's not going to take all our luggage. We can't go back. So will you send a destroyer?" So Dickie Mountbatten pops up with the HMS Kelly, and they go back with their 80 pieces of luggage. So this is him back at the War Office, and he's offered 2 jobs. He can be regional commissioner in Wales, or he can be the liaison officer to the French First Army. Oh, he says, "I'd like to go to Wales." So George VI says, "You better go back to France." So he goes back to France, and this is a very good opportunity for the British, because the British are very keen to discover what the French defences are. Of course, they've got the famous Maginot Line. And they're quite deferential to the royals, and so they let him go and do these reports on the defences. And he reports on how poor morale is, actually how bad the defences are. People can just come around the side. And he gives these reports to the British. The problem is he also gives them to Charles Beddoe. And Charles Beddoe gives them to the Germans. The Germans changed their invasion plan. And we all know what happened on the 7th of May, 1940. They went round the side of the Maginot Line. So this was a second scandal. Basically, the former king of Britain betrayed the French plans that let the Germans actually invade France. So he then, basically after a while, a few months, he gives up in doing this job. He's rolled bored, he goes and plays golf. And then, of course, the Germans are moving in on Paris, and rather than stay at his post, one night he says to Fruity Metcalfe, "See you in the morning, Fruity." Fruity says, "Fine." Next morning, Fruity comes in, and the Duke has scarpered with the car and the petrol and legged it down to the south of France, leaving Fruity to spend the next 2 weeks hitching his way back through the troops to get back to Britain. So that's how he treats his friends. Anyway, he then gets to the south of France. Churchill says, "Look, the only way you're going to get out now is to go to Spain, to Portugal, and we'll send a flying boat and pick you up and bring you back." He goes first of all into Spain, and this is when something called Operation Willy begins. And this is the attempt by the Germans to basically entrap him and persuade him to come back if Britain's invaded or Britain sues for peace as a British pétain figure, as a go-lighter figure. Now, one of the extraordinary things when I was researching this book was to discover the number of peace overtures that went on, not just up to September 39, but right through the summer of 1940 and indeed into 41, and that they were taken very seriously. Sometimes they were allowed to run to see what would happen, but Churchill, when he was saying we'll fight them on the beaches, was actually discussing suing for a negotiated peace with the Germans. And that's understandable, because if you think of the German advance going through, it did look pretty tricky. One of the other interesting questions for historians is why did the Germans halt their advance on the Nord Canal to allow the British Expeditionary Force to escape? And no one's really been able to answer this. I think I can, because if you look at the correspondence that was going on with the Duke, with the Germans, in this exactly the same moment, you can see that Hitler thought that he could do a deal, that he could save the British Army. I mean, he's not just talking to the Duke, he was talking to Lord Halifax and all sorts of other people. But he could do a deal with them. The Duke would then come back, and they could turn their attentions, the Germans, on the real threat, which was communism. And that was the view of the Duke of Windsor, that actually the real threat to the British Empire wasn't the Germans, it was the Russians. And that, of course, was what appeasement was about, but that was up to September 1939. It was not what was being discussed in the summer of 1940. One of the other scandals is he goes back, the Duke of Windsor, in the January 1940, goes back and actually tries to create a peace party in Britain with Beaverbrook. And this, he's again been monitored by various people, so we get accounts in Chamberlain's diary. What he hadn't realized is that his police protection officer, David Sturio, was filing reports on who he was seeing, what he was saying, back to the Met and the Home Office and to the Royal Household. Again, those reports are in the archives, not here, but elsewhere. So this is a place called Cascas outside Lisbon, and this is where he gets involved with a German agent called Ricardo Espirito de Santo, who was a banker there. In fact, he's the banker for the Nazis. And this is where a lot of the plotting goes on. In fact, we now have accounts from Portuguese Secret Service files, surveillance files, how the Duke got rid of his protection, he was going in and out of the German embassy. And we also know from documents were discovered after the war, which were never meant to be discovered, what we call the captured German documents, which were meant to have been burnt, but actually were found. We have, in fact, chapter and verse of all the things that were going on at this time, in terms of the telegrams and the correspondence, which was pretty dynamite stuff, which we'll come to a little bit later. So there he is, basically intriguing with De Santo. He doesn't report any of these approaches to the British, though of course they know about them. In fact, the Germans allow his maid to go up to Paris to recover some linen for him. He delays his stay there to see what's happening in terms of the world events by insisting that his valet, who's been called up for military service, is retained. And we even have quotes of him saying to Hitler, if you really want to get Britain to capitulate, you just need to bomb them like hell. And that's in the captured German documents. And this was the man who organized Operation Willy. He's a man called Walter Schellenberg, who was a German SS officer, a very bright, ambitious man. And he, in fact, was offered the Duke large sums of money to go and wait out the war in Switzerland until he could be brought back. But Churchill is monitoring all this, and we have, of course, the ultra-decrypts, but also he's got people in the household reporting back. At one point, he threatens him with a court-martial. And then they decide that the best solution is to deal with him, to contain him, is to send him off to be governor of the Bahamas. So that's what they do. And here he is getting on the boat to go off to the Bahamas. It's a posting he described as Exile. The Bahamas is very small. It's so inconsequential in terms of colonial office appointments that you don't even get your K if you go there. But anyway, he's sent off there. Now, one of the really interesting things is that he remains in contact. He says, I'm going off, clearly the events haven't panned out as we thought, but I'm ready and waiting when the call comes. And he communicates with Espiritu de Santo by code, en route in Bermuda, saying, I'm ready to come back when you want me. So this is communication with the enemy in code during war. That is a capital offense. But of course, that's all been covered up. Lord Haw was executed for far less than this. So anyway, he gets to the Bahamas, looks quite nice, that's Government House, it's just been done up for him, but he says, I don't like it. Can you redo it? And they say, well, it's going to cost us about 5 Spitfires to do this. And he says, I don't care, I'm going to either go to my ranch in Canada or go home. So they spend 5 Spitfires doing it up to make it look like that. And meanwhile, he goes and stays with a man called Harry Oakes, who is probably the richest man of the Bahamas. He's a Canadian who's there as a tax exile. And there they are in their finery. And that's Harry Oakes. And Harry Oakes is to play quite an important part in the story. One of the great mysteries of his time in the Bahamas is an event that took place on the 8th of July, 1943, at this place here, Westbourne. On that morning, Harry Oakes is found murdered in his bed. He's had, I think, probably a boat hook thrust into his face. He's then been set his face on fire and his genitals on fire, and he's been covered with feathers to make it look like a voodoo killing. The Duke is one of the first people to be informed, and instead of ringing and getting the local policeman, chief of police, to deal with it, in fact, he arranges for that chief of police to be seconded immediately to Trinidad. Instead of calling in Scotland Yard, instead of calling the FBI from New York, instead of calling in someone from the base, there was a police section there, he calls in 2 cops from Miami, 2 crooked cops who were part of Mayor Lansky's criminal enterprise down there. And they come, and what they do is they immediately arrest this man here, Alfred de Marigny, Harry Oakes' son-in-law, who the Duke doesn't like. There's no evidence, of course, but that doesn't matter. They produce their own evidence. They find that there's a fingerprint of his on a screen in the room where Oakes has been killed, until the defense actually show that the print is not an original print. It's been taken off a glass and actually been put onto the screen by the 2 crooked cops. Now, we say, why is this happening? Well, the answer is this man, Harold Christie, who's another part, in some ways, this triumvirate. He's a property developer. His best client is Harry Oakes. Harry Oakes discovers that he's been double-crossing him and says he's not going to do any more business with Christie. Christie, Oakes, and the Duke are also involved in a money-making operation to take money out of the Bahamas and their course currency restrictions and invest it in a German bank, the Banco Continental, in Mexico. In fact, they've all put in, well, the Duke hasn't, but Oakes has put in 5 million. That's 5 million is, of course, never accounted for and is distributed, I think, between Christie and the Duke. And this is the other rather dodgy character the Duke gets to know. It's called Axel Venagran. He's the founder of Electrolux. He's very close to the Nazis. He's actually called Goering's pal. He's a tax exile also in the Bahamas. He comes almost immediately after the Duke arrives in August 1940. He then develops this big estate called Shangri-La with these very deep harbors, which the authorities think are being used to refuel German U-boats. And there are huge numbers of files, both in the British and the American intelligence communities, where they actually say and write to the Duke saying, don't get involved with Axel Venagran, he's basically a German agent. And the Duke says, oh, well, he gets a nice yacht, I like going on it, and I'll make my own friends if I want to, thank you very much. So you can see there's some very dubious characters hanging around the Duke. There the Duke is hard at work. In some ways, the posting is the making of Wallis. She gets involved with the Red Cross. We've got a picture over here. She gets involved with children's clinics and serves in a canteen for servicemen on the base. The Duke does very little, partly because it's very difficult for him to do anything, because the island is run by a group of businessmen, the Bay Street Boys, of which Christie is one. And basically, he can't do much. He doesn't have many powers, and frankly, he has no interest in rocking the boat. So instead, he plays golf, he goes to strip shows, he just drinks. There's an extraordinary account by a man called Patrick Skene Catling, who's still alive, who's posted to the island, and met him on the golf course one day. The Duke was driving in his Cadillac from hole to hole. And he then said, get into the car and I'll take you somewhere where I go every Thursday. And they drive down into one of the black townships, and suddenly all these little black boys run out with sticks, and they actually parade in front of the Duke, who takes the salute in the car. And then he drives off, and he does that every Thursday. So he's replicating his life in Britain, the life that he sort of was maneuvered out of throughout his life. And there'll be plenty of occasions like that. At the end of the war, he lobbies Attlee and Churchill for a job, and they say, no way, you've got very unfortunate friends, we can't trust you. Basically, we don't want you to come back, you're best staying in America. The problem in America is he would have to pay tax. But he does come to some arrangement where he spends half the year here at the Waldorf Astoria and half the year in France. The French basically make him give him a tax status, and he's able to and cheap accommodation, cheap rents, duty-free, and all sorts of things. Now, this figure here is Alan Lascelles, who's the monarch's private secretary. He's a key figure in this story. Lascelles, in fact, even before he became king, said to Baldwin, I hope he kills himself in a steeplechase accident, because we really don't want him to be king. And Baldwin says, I agree. And Lascelles records in his diary, which are again at Churchill College, Cambridge, the fact of the discovery of these German documents, but he also confirms that, and must have it from intelligence sources, that the Duke was communicating with the Germans in code during the war, offering to come back as a Petain figure. And this other chap, he looks a bit the same, another man with a moustache and a bald head, Guy Liddell, director of MI5, again, an incredible source for us historians, because he kept a diary all through the war, which he wasn't supposed to do. And so he records all these events. And again, he confirms all the investigations into the Duke of Windsor during the war as this traitor. In fact, poor old George VI is told the news about this because from these captured German documents. As he comes out, he goes out to the VE Day crowds to take the cheers. And as he walks in, old Alan Lascelles tells him, by the way, your brother was consorting with the Nazis. Because what happened was in May 1945, the Germans are retreating, and a man called von Losch, who decides that this will be his calling card, he's a sort of clerk in the foreign ministry, saves all these files, buries them in the forest, and when the American army come through, he leads them to these files, and there is chapter and verse, all the dealings with the Duke of Windsor. The other interesting thing is, and it's been a great mystery again to historians, when Anthony Blunt was interviewed in 1963 by Peter Wright, Michael Adine, the Queen's private secretary, said, look, he may mention a trip at the end of the war to a place called Cronberg. This is Cronberg. That has nothing to do with his treachery, so just don't go there. And it's always sort of rather intrigued Peter Wright, and historians have always wondered, what was there at Cronberg that Blunt was sent there on a mission to recover in the end of the war? And we now know. I actually found a diary in Keble College, Oxford, of a man called David Price, who was an officer at Cronberg at this time. And just casually one day, wandering around, he said he went to the library, opened a drawer, and it's filled with correspondence from the Duke of Windsor to Prince Philip of Hesse, who was actually a Nazi general. That was what Blunt was going to pick up. And of course, that was his calling card when it came to the immunity later on. So that is another little sideshow. Now we get to another scandal, the Ednam Lodge robbery, 1946 in Berkshire. The couple have come back to stay with their friend, the Earl of Dudley. They've come back with all their jewels. They don't put them in the safe, though they're offered the chance to do so. They put them under the bed. And that night, a cat burglar climbs in through an open window, takes the jewels, and there's a big hoo-ha. Millions of pounds of jewels have been stolen. No one has ever been caught for the robbery. And so they claim on the insurance. That's all they can do. Well, the mystery is solved after their death when there's a huge auction of the Duchess of Wallis's jewellery. You know where I'm going with this. And there are all the jewels that were supposed to have been stolen in 1946, which they claimed on insurance. So we're really not getting a very good picture, are we? So you think Prince Andrew's bad. So they have another house. This is another of their houses in Paris. And they tend to, all they do basically, he's interested in gardening, golf, his stocks, and entertaining. And they mix all sorts of people. Maria Callas, I think there's Clark Gable there, Darryl Zanuck, all sorts of people. There's a wonderful story that Rex Harrison's son told me of they're going up to have dinner with Rex Harrison and Lily Palmer in Portofino. And Harrison couldn't stand them. And so when he drove them back down to Portofino, they were in an open-top Jeep. He tried to drive as quickly as he could and swerve as much as he could in the hope that they might just go off. But anyway, they hung on for dear life. Anyway, this is the house you probably associate with them, the Bois de Boulogne, which is where they lived for the last part of their life. Oops, oh God. Well, that's the end of it. Thanks very much. God, you kind of... Oops, God, what's happened there? Oh, God. Okay. This is a man called Jimmy Donahue. Jimmy Donahue was the heir to the Woolworth millions. He was a playboy figure, and he became Wallis's lover. In fact, there's some suggestion the Duke was also attracted to him. And one of the great benefits of Jimmy was he always picked up the bill, and that's what the Windsors really liked. But he also made Wallis feel young, he was fun to be with, and the Duke was busy writing his Book of King's Story, and so Wallis spent a lot of time with him in various nightclubs. Now, the extraordinary thing about Jimmy Donahue is he was bisexual. So the wits would quip that actually she'd swapped a king for a queen. And now let's see if we get to the next one. There we are. And again, by going to the French archives, you probably can't read this, but the French, everyone was bugging the Duke of Windsor. So the British were bugging him. The FBI had people doing surveillance and telephone taps, and the French were doing it. And so this is a surveillance report of the night with Jimmy Donahue coming back and staying the night with Wallis. All the previous books said, oh, he was gay, it was all platonic, and there's no evidence for it. Well, here is evidence of him spending the night with her. On this night, actually, the Duke was at his mum's funeral. It says something about Jimmy Donahue. This, I think, is a very poignant picture. It's a picture at the El Morocco nightclub, New Year's Eve, 1957. I'm afraid I didn't get the whole of the zebra sofa there. But this is a rather pathetic picture, isn't it? They've been crowned on New Year's Eve, and they've sort of had to enter the joke because everyone else is picking up the bill. Anyway, the family at Feud, they realize that they've got to somehow sort this out. In fact, it's playing very badly in the press. And so when, in 1967, they're invited back to unveil a plaque to Queen Mary in the Mall. So you can see them there, the Queen Mum and various people. But they're not invited to stay at Buckingham Palace. They're not even invited to the lunch afterwards. They have to go and have lunch with Marina, Duchess of Kent. The only house that they owned was this house called The Mill, just outside Paris, which they would go to every weekend, where he was able to create a garden, very like an English garden, and where they would entertain, and which she did up. Now, one of the myths, again, of Wallis is that she was a woman with great style. Okay, I'm going to just give you try a vox pox. Anyone got a house like that? Maybe that's the big thing in West Cowes. And there we are, pink and green always goes well. So the report they did get the report. In 1972, in May 1972, the Queen, on a state visit to Paris, does go up and see the Duke. They know that he's dying, and the hatchet is buried, and attempts are made to basically keep him on side. Because, of course, now what they're worried about is that his stuff should go back to the royal family. I mean, the garter robes, all the artifacts he's got, the correspondence, all these things. There's a damage limitation exercise going on. And this is the Duchess, actually trooping the colour, which happened just afterwards. She comes back for the funeral. One of the myths is that this was a great love affair. Well, the night nurse who was there when the Duke of Windsor died said that though Wallis had a room 2 doors away from him, and every night he would call out Wallis, she never once visited him in the last 2 weeks of his life. He died in the arms of the night nurse, not of Wallis. Anyway, here she is, looking rather harrowed, rather upset. She's actually heavily tranquilized. For the first time, she's brought to Buckingham Palace only because they're worried that she'll make a scene at Claridge's. And there she is. The Prince Philip is brought in with the Mountbatten to basically ensure that she agrees that all this stuff should be sent back to the Royal Archives, where it has been brought back. Now, the Royal Archives is a bit like a restaurant with no menu. You just go in there and you're given what they want you to have, which is generally very little. So basically, stuff goes into the Royal Archives and never really comes out, and that's what's happened to his papers. She then becomes under the grip of this woman called Metrobloom, who is a very sinister French lawyer who basically starts selling off some of the property, and supposedly to pay hospital bills, but I think a lot of it goes into her own pocket. The Duchess lives on for another 14 years, to 1986. She's basically a vegetable by then. Some of you may have seen some of the pictures. She just lives off a diet of vodka, which she drinks from a silver tankard. She has to be carried everywhere. She's in a darkened room. All her friends are kept away from her, and she's just controlled by Metrobloom. So this is her service at St. George's, Windsor. And finally, the two are reunited at Frogmore. She still hasn't been given her treasured HRH status, which of course is totally illegal. All her sisters-in-law had it. The irony is that she ended up with a morganatic marriage, the very thing that everyone said she couldn't have in 1936. So it's a pretty tragic story. It's a very sad story, but it also, I think, gives us a slightly different take on actually the abdication. I think, frankly, Wallis saved us from a terrible king, and they were quite right, Baldwin and the others, to basically push him into a position where he was forced to abdicate. He could have fought it. He could easily have won. There could have been a compromise. He could have decided to marry her after he was crowned. He could have insisted that she had this morganatic title. So the history, I think, was changed in that week in 1936. There's lots of other stuff. I mean, the currency smuggling, the black market dealings, lots and lots of stories in the book, how badly they treated their staff. Poor old Sidney, the Bahamian butler who served with them from 1940 till the 1970s. His wife died, and he asked if he could go home early to take care of his children at 5. She said, if you go at 5, don't bother coming back. And time again, people are sacked. They underpaid their staff because they thought it was a privilege to work for them. And they were completely nuts. So, for example, the lamb's lettuce in the salad had to be cut to the same size. The sheets were ironed twice a day. The loo roll, they perforated and put it in piles. I mean, it was an extraordinary, weird life. He really liked just speaking German, and so the poor golfers in Palm Beach, he would just suddenly break into German with them and know what was going on. And then at the middle of meals, he would start conducting Oompa Poompa music. This is not the picture you get, I'm afraid, in the official lives, but it's the picture you get in Traitor King. And we're very happy to answer some questions.
Well, first of all, thank you. What a pair of lives, an amazing story, so thank you. What was the biggest surprise to you? I mean, it seemed to me surprise after surprise as I was sitting here, but given you are a historian, you've written before, what was the insight that really even hit you as surprising?
To be able to back up the Traitor King instinct that I had and to have the Lessel and Liddell confirmation, that was very important. The other was to discover that they were bisexual, and they used to be, there was a guy called Scotty Bowers in Hollywood. He'd go to the Beverly Hills Hotel, and he would procure young boys and girls for each of them. And they pretended they'd never been to the Beverly Hills Hotel. The bisexuality of the Duke, his affair with a man called Walter Chrysler, who was the son of the car manufacturer. And some of that stuff's hinted at in Chips Channon. Nicky Haslam knew about it. who knew them, still alive, of course. So those were two of the things. I think just the sheer dishonesty of the man. When you see if people were, I mean, for example, he used a man called John Waterlove, who was his secretary, to do some of these currency black market dealings. And then when basically when it was discovered, they tried to put the blame on another secretary called Anne Seagram, and she was sacked. Waterlove threatened to go to the papers with the story, and there was long discussions again about how to basically see him while he was paid off. But he was making millions from things like that. They were they were sponging off people. They were being paid to attend events. They would even vet guest lists that they went to. It is an extraordinary thing. And of course, there's a fascinating parallel with modern life. Can you think of a couple with, I've got to be careful what I say, a not very bright, charismatic prince who marries an American divorcee, is manipulated, taken away from his friends and family, bad parenting is blamed, falling out with loved siblings and sisters-in-law, debates over finances and security, the curation of the story through tame journalists and book publishers, the way that they sue everyone. I don't know. I sort of feel that maybe something like that happening now. So there's a playbook. If one could just, they would look at it. Yep.
Oh, sorry.
History repeating itself, of course. First of all, how long did it take to do the research? It was for some time, I imagine. And will this become a film? Because it would make a wonderful one.
I think, I'd love it to be a film. It's a great film. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've got Any Human Heart, which deals a little bit with the Bahamas. I did it very quickly. I have a full-time job, but my Mountbatten book came out in August 2019, so 2 years ago. I started researching then, and of course we then got straight into the lockdown. Archives were closed. So I researched the book basically from August 2019 through till February this year. I wrote it between February and May, and it came out a few weeks ago. So it was quite quick, yeah. The first book, I mean, my Guy Burgess took 15 years, so I thought I'd better speed up a bit.
The friendship with Mountbatten and Churchill is fascinating because clearly they were very close friends originally on with the Prince of Wales. Did that come to a sudden end, or did that endure through the Duke of Windsor's life?
Well, the relationship with Mountbatten actually did endure, interestingly enough. They fell out. I mean, the Prince had been his best man. Then there was this falling out at the abdication because Dicky basically saw the way the wind was blowing and didn't come out as his best man. But actually, looking at the Royal Archives, which I finally got into the other day, they did actually keep in touch. Mountbatten and Wallis didn't get on, so they would only do it when Wallis went to get a facelift. She had about 6 of them. So that's when he would sort of meet her. The Churchill relationship, he of course had been the great proponent of the King's Party, but I think he got fed up when he saw what he was up to during the Second World War. And actually they were both invited on Onassis' yacht in the 1950s, and Churchill refused to go. He said, "I will not be on the same boat as that man." But even so, Churchill and Eisenhower tried to suppress the whole story of the Margberg files. They tried to, there was all this fascinating correspondence, and Eisenhower was prepared to agree to it, and it was only because the documents were with American historians that they were actually saved, but they delayed the publication until 1957. And even then, it was all dismissed as basically, people trying to keep in with the German authorities. But it's actually dynamic stuff.
And was the love story entirely one-sided then? That he was besotted with her, she not with him. Why then did she give in?
Well, he was besotted with her. She was the mother figure, and it was a sub-dom relationship. So, for example, the more awful she was to him, the more he loved it. He loved being sent to bed in tears. So it was weird. She liked having that sense power over him. It, of course, gave her a great lifestyle. And I think she felt he'd given up the throne for her. She could hardly then disappear. And so she was stuck with him, which is why she had these affairs. She also had an affair with a guy called Russell Knipe, who was a singer and actor. And I think there are others, too, which I just didn't find. So they sort of rumbled along together as this couple. But she basically bossed him around. And he never really grew up. He liked the fact that she was this mother figure to him. And she was the child that she never had. it's a very strange thing. I've got a whole chapter on their sexual relationship, which I recommend.
In some ways, your title sort of undersells itself in the sense traitor king. It's far more than just a traitor. What do you think drove this man in terms of his behaviours? We've got sexual drive, political drive. Is it risk-taking, criminality? I mean, with your assessment and depth of research, what do you think's behind the behaviours of this person?
Well, I think he's just very self-entitled, and I think he'd been spoilt as a child. He'd been emotionally deprived of affection, so he was looking for something. He was actually very inadequate as a man, not very bright. And when Churchill gave him a copy of his speeches, he said, "I'll put it on the shelf with the others." And when he went to a Mozart concert, he said, "I like that. Did he write anything else?" But I think he regretted the fact. He realised that he regretted the abdication. He felt he had let Wallis down. She was always berating him. She was terrible rows where she gave him a hard time, and that's why he gave her all the jewellery. That's why he wanted her to have the state visit in Germany. So he was always trying to please her, and he had no interest. He had no inner life. He was anti-Semitic. He thought Hitler was a good thing even in the 1960s. One of his best friends was Oswald Mosley. He was just a very dishonest, inadequate figure, and I think people realized that. I mean, there was this great gap between the public image of this very charismatic prince and the reality of what he was like. So that's why everyone wanted to basically contain him and keep him away, with them not doing too much damage. But I don't know what drove him. I don't think he was sufficiently reflective to even sort of think it through. I think he was very vain. He loved clothes, and it was something called Pants Across the Sea, where he had his jackets made in London, his trousers made in America for some reason with a zip and stuff. But he was very vain, and I think he was very flattered by the Germans. So, and he felt he'd basically cocked up, and he wanted to try and make amends in some way. He thought he could be. He was a little man who thought he could be a big man. I'm not invited to Buckingham Palace garden parties anymore.
You mentioned the auctioning of Wallis's jewellery. What happened to the estate? What happened? Who inherited?
The estate was given to the Institut Pasteur, a cancer charity in Paris, and Michael Bloch, who worked with Metrobloom, wrote several books based on the papers, quite sympathetic books. And then the Institut Pasteur used the money from the sales for their work, but they gave the papers and things to the Royal Archives. Everything ended up in the Royal Archives, like Hotel California. It goes one way. Some of the furniture, as a thank you to the French government, they gave to the French government, and they had extraordinary collections of mice and china and things, which went to museums. And then there was some stuff, like some picture albums, which they gave to the gardener. And that's actually, fortunately, the only stuff that we've been able, that fortunately they did that, because as a result, that was then sold on the open market, and we've now can find it. The reason I discovered about the Walter Chrysler thing was the love letters to Walter Chrysler were actually sold at auction in the States. They wouldn't be in the National Archives. Or if they were under lock and key. Yeah.
We know that the Queen Mother loathed the Duke of Windsor. How much of what you've told us this evening do you suppose the royal family know or knew? And have you sent them a copy of your book?
Well, she was called the Witch of Glamis by Wallis and Cookie, yeah, and that woman. Actually, funnily enough, the Queen Mum is meant to be the steely one who said, this awful woman. Actually, Bertie was equally steely if you look at the correspondence. The royal family, I think, knew pretty early on. I'm sure they were briefed very early on, and that's why they were so angry with them and really didn't want anything to do with them. Wallis never was entertained by the royal family until that 67 episode. The Queen met her for the first time after the abdication then. My first book, on John Buchan, was actually given by the royal household as a Christmas gift to all their staff. I'm not sure this one will be. When the palace has been asked to make comment, they've said no comment. So we just don't know what they think. I would have just said, look, you think it's bad now. Look at how bad it was before. But it's interesting that we've not had. I normally get lots of reviews for my books. I've not had many reviews for the book, and though we had good ones, from the TLS and others. The Times, the Sunday Times, for example, who fought over Cyril for my book last time, haven't covered it. The Guardian, the Observer. No one wants to touch the story, I think. Yeah.
What actually made you decide to write it?
Well, when you're trying to find ideas for biographies, you want to find a subject which you think you've got a new take, something new material or a new interpretation. You've got to have access. You've got to think that there's material there that you can draw on, and you've got to think of the market. And the great thing about The Crown is it has really made the market for royal biography great, because you can then, everyone knows in the States who these people are. And the other thing is royal biographies have traditionally not, shall we say, been synonymous with archival research. I mean, what happens is a journalist goes and talks to the police protection officer or whatever it is, and they write their story. No one actually goes and looks in the files to try as a historian. Serious historians look down on royal biography, that they don't think it's important. But actually, these are fantastic characters, complex and important roles in society, and everyone knows who they are. So they're good subjects. I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do next. I mean, maybe Andrew and Fergie, but I'd love to find stuff, but it's really difficult to find good subjects that will get me invited here. I think time for a drink, isn't it?
Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, on your behalf, enormous thanks to Andrew Lownie. A fascinating talk.
Thank you very much for participating in the Isle of Wight Literary Festival. If you've enjoyed this presentation, please consider making a donation. Follow the Donate Now button from the homepage of our website. You can also benefit from great discounts by ordering via Blackwell's Bookshop from our homepage. We'd like to thank the loyal sponsors and supporters who've sustained the Isle of Wight Literary Festival over the past years. Without their financial contribution, it will be difficult to attract the many wonderful speakers we've hosted, while keeping ticket prices down. This year, their support has enabled us to provide the digital festival free of charge.